Hi, everyone. This is Laura Bennett from the Music, Medicine, and Machines Meetup Group based here in DC and New York City. We're a meetup group that meets pretty frequently around the concepts of music, medicines, and machine learning. And we're going to explore technologies such as data governance, IoT, machine learning, wearables, and the such. And today we have Randy Gordon with us today. He is very much a firm data governance expert with this great background as a musician. So Randy, I'd love to turn it over to you and just hear a little bit more about your background.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks so much for having me today. And to everyone watching, I hope you are all safe and well and managing the best you can through this challenging time. So, as Laura mentioned, I actually am a performing musician. That's how I started my professional life. I went to music school, I studied cello, and I came out of school. I didn't want to do anything else but music, and I took any musical gig that came along. I taught, I worked at music school. After a year or so of that, I found out I wasn't enjoying it. I didn't like the fact that I had to make my living on this solely because I had no choice in terms of what gigs I had to take, even if they were just really awful. So I thought I should get a day job and then play at night. And that's what I did. I started out actually in insurance. I grew up in the Hartford area, so that was a natural place to begin. I worked in group insurance, group health insurance for quite a few years, playing the gigs I wanted to at night, the good gigs, the orchestras and musicals. Then I changed direction after my company went through a lot of mergers, and I ended up losing my job, and I found my way into the world of financial services. I had actually gone back for a graduate degree while I was in insurance in financial services. And at that point, my wife and I were interested in moving closer to New York. So I landed in a consulting role at Merrill Lynch. And I was with Merrill Lynch and then Bank of America, when Bank of America bought Merrill Lynch during the crisis. I was with them for over 14 years. And that's where I really became involved with data. I worked in data management, data quality, and ultimately data governance. And data governance in the years following the financial crisis was actually a really good place to be because all the financial regulators wanted the banks to focus on data quality, data lineage, the traceability of data from consumption back to creation. And so I had plenty of work to do, and I really learned a lot from my time at Bank of America. They were pretty advanced in the data governance world. After that, I moved on to Moody's Corporation, where I actually built their data governance organization and framework from scratch. And it just seemed to be a field that really suited me and a field that was a great place to be. Things began to change over the last couple of years in terms of how fast technology was moving and the sheer volume of data. And when I left Moody's last year, I gave a lot of thought of what I wanted to do next, because it seemed like a lot of the things I had been doing seemed sort of outmoded. So I spent some time, took some time off, started to play a little bit more, which was good, and came upon a way of thinking about data governance, which tied into my music background.
So, I read your article that you wrote where you combined the data governance piece with Bach and his fugues. And I found that utterly fascinating in how you positioned us with the music. You set us up to understand the musical structure, and then you guided us into the data governance piece. And I would love to hear about how did you marry the data governance and the music piece, and then maybe a little bit more on your article that you wrote.
Sure. So as I said, I was struck over the last couple of years about how fast technology was changing, and also the sheer volume of data that was being created every day. It's huge. There's articles about it. Not just the kind of structured data we data governance professionals are used to working with in databases, but unstructured data, documents, social media, emails. and it seemed to me that these approaches that we had all used in the last decade to manage this data were not really workable now. So I did a lot of reading, and it was interesting. I read about things like DevOps, which is the way of technology moving from development to deployment in minutes, the way Amazon and Google and Facebook do their thing. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, but where does data governance fit in there? But from those readings in DevOps and also data ops, which I'll talk about a little later, I saw a reference to a book, which is a fascinating book I never heard of, by Eliyahu Goldratt and Jeff Cox, called The Goal. Highly recommended. It's a fun book because it's one of those business books that's written like a novel. It's about a plant manager in the 80s whose plant is failing. And he goes to his physics professor, who is really Goldratt's alter ego, because Goldratt was a physicist. And his physicist challenges him to think differently. And then the first thing the physicist says is, what's the goal of your plant, of your manufacturing plant? And the plant manager says, to create products, to increase productivity. And the physicist says, go back and rethink that. And I'm not going to give away the novel because it reads like a novel. It's really exciting. I'm not going to give away what the goal is, but it made me think, gee, maybe I need to rethink of the goal of data governance as a way of how to approach this in today's world. And I thought, well, I'm not a physicist. My father was, and he used to bore me to death when he talked about physics. And I thought, I'm a musician. So how could I look at this question of the goal of data governance from a music standpoint? It's funny, as soon as I oriented myself that way, I thought of the fugue, and actually J.S. Bach's masterwork, The Art of the Fugue. And the reason, as I look back, I thought about it was, what was troubling me was data governance was being viewed to me more and more of a hindrance to innovation. All these steps you had to go through, and the data governance councils you had to get approval for, that was stifling creativity. And I thought about the fact that in music, a musical structure like the fugue has not stifled creativity. It's generated amazing innovation and invention. And Bach was the great practitioner of the fugue, but many other composers have written in the structure. So I thought, gee, maybe there's an idea here. Maybe providing a structure is actually a good thing. And so I started to look closer at the art of the fugue, because that in a way is Bach's way of taking the fugue to as many different variations as he can, going with basically the same material. And I hadn't really spent too much time in college actually delving into what the structure of the fugue was. You know, I was a performing musician. I wasn't doing a lot of theory. But what I found fascinating was, again, by following this structure, which was not a complicated structure, but it was a structure, and following certain rules, a composer like Bach could generate so much wonderful music. And that's something that I talk about, the basic idea, and I use some musical examples you can find in my article. Some of the basic ideas around the fugue are, there's three main characteristics, three pieces of the framework, as you will. You got data governance, we always talk about frameworks, right? Data governance framework. Well, a fugue framework has three components. Every fugue has a distinctive melody, a theme, a subject, which you hear in the beginning. And then that subject is repeated, often in different ways, by other voices in the music. A fugue always has at least two different voices, instruments, what have you, usually three, sometimes four, sometimes five. So there's that unique theme, you hear it in the beginning. And then that theme reappears in what's called imitation in music. And imitation, I think, is familiar to a lot of us because we know canons like Frere Jacques and Row Row Your Boat. I think everyone knows how those work. One person starts singing the melody, and another person then comes in, sings exactly the same, and so on. That's a canon. It's very strict that way. And there's not a lot of room for innovation and invention there. But Bach and other writers within the composers using the fugue form would follow it imitation, but it would not be an exact imitation. And the first voice, instrument, whatever, would not continue along the same way as the second voice, etc. So it wasn't, there's a lot more variation. But again, you had the imitation. And then you had something which I think speaks very much to our data world today, which is these voices would create a contrapuntal texture. And counterpoint in music is how you can put multiple melodies together, playing them at the same time, and have them sound good. What are the rules for doing that? That's the rules of counterpoint. So a fugue uses counterpoint to allow multiple voices to be doing different things and still sound good to the listener and also make sense to the listener. And that to me was very meaningful, because one of the things that's happened with data today is you, again, are using so many types of data, structured, unstructured, social media, whatever. And we have the concept of data lakes that came about 6-7 years ago, where you can create this structure, this system that lets you basically dump data in from all these different sources. They don't have to follow a certain format. And that was supposed to yield tremendous insight into data and all kinds of innovation. More often than not, as the literature around this shows, data lakes have evolved into data swamps, where the data just is thrown together and nobody can make any sense of it. And I thought that's a lot like the concept of a contrapuntal musical texture. We talk about in music that there's 3 types of combining musical voices. There's homophony, which is really a melody and harmony. And that's what most of us think about when we hear music, right? I mean, songs are basically homophony. Mm-hmm. You have melody, and you have an accompaniment, and it could be simple chords, it could be something more elaborate, but still one melody. Polyphony is where you have multiple melodies going on at the same time. It's not that common in today's popular music, but it was the norm going back to the Renaissance. I mean, it's out there in some popular music. Someone had mentioned to me that when he read my article, he thought of Guys and Dolls, the musical, and the fugue for tin horns at the beginning. If you remember that musical, that's a fugue. You've got multiple voices. The 3 guys are singing their own parts. It all comes together sounding good. So polyphony, I think, is what we want when we combine all this data in a data lake or other type of vehicle. What we get more often is cacophony, which is music thrown together, melodies thrown together that don't make any sense, don't sound good, don't follow rules of counterpoint, can't be understood. It just sounds like noise. And there's a lot of cacophony out there in the data world today. So those things about the fugue, the fact that it has a theme that you can follow, and it becomes, as I mentioned in my article, sort of the metadata that the listener has to make sure that they know where they are. It has this imitation, and it has that polyphony. So all these voices, even though they're doing their own things, sound good, and the listener can make sense of them. I thought, gee, that makes the fugue a very good metaphor of today's music, and it makes the structure something that we might want to think about going from a fugue framework to a data governance framework.
Yeah, I like how you wrote about it, and then you would present the piece of music at different points after you illustrated a different point. So you basically covered all of the aspects of the fugue that we could use in data governance. So in reality, it just strikes me that the position of your paper is where we're looking at data governance. It's more than just compliance and, you know, following a checkbox list. Let's use it to create innovation, but provide structure to the data that we're trying to understand. So it's almost like we're creating 4 different parts, just as an example, and they each have their own part they're playing, but they sound very good together. And that's where you're trying to take us, correct?
Correct. And it's interesting, while I was writing that article, I read a book by Laura Madsen, the person who actually introduced me to this group, and it's called, I'll show it here, Disrupting Data Governance. And Laura and I have talked, and she had very much the same idea about that the purpose of data governance needs to move from this control and compliance framework and obsession, really, and it makes sense given what the regulators are telling the banks, to more about how do we enable data to get out to people to use it, and how do we make it usable, and how do we give it context? And that is really in line with what I'm thinking too, that if we think about the goal, and so at the end of my article, I propose a goal for data governance as providing the structure for invention. I like the word invention rather than innovation. Innovation gets used a lot, but invention also talks to discovery and finding meaning. So I like that. But it's a very similar idea to Laura's, that we need to focus on making the data usable and freeing up the creativity of the people using it. And it doesn't mean we don't need to worry about control, because one of the things we need to make sure, I think, in order to foster that creativity, is we want to make sure the right users get to the right data at the right time. A user can't be worried about, gee, should I be seeing this data? No, we can't have that. So the controls on access still really important. You want to make it accessible to the people that should have access to it. Data quality is still critical, because you want to rely and trust this data in order to use the data. So that's still critical. I think what rises to me as far as importance is a principle we used to talk about, which is data must be understandable. Because that to me is the true message to me of the fugue. It makes this very complex texture understandable to the user. They listen for the theme and like. So that to me speaks to the importance of tools like data catalogs that help you maneuver through all types of data. It makes things like data lineage important, because you need to understand, where did this data come from? How did it get to be this way? So those kinds of things to me are heightened, because again, to the extent that I understand the data, I'll be more effective creating, innovating, and finding invention within it.
Yeah, I think that's where we want to go in healthcare too, is, you know, inventing new uses for data. And we're just collecting so much data across the enterprise and healthcare, and implementing EHRs. You know, Defense Health Agency is implementing an EHR, VA is implementing the same EHR, but their data attributes are going to be different, because you're dealing with, you know, active soldiers to, you know, veterans, and the healthcare problems are completely different. And now we're in the midst of a pandemic. We're collecting all this data in a decentralized environment, and you have different companies collecting the data. You have different entities collecting the data. They're all doing their own interpretation. So when we talk about, you know, taking that structure you're thinking about applying in the data environment, how do you think we can apply that in this pandemic so we can really get some valuable insights out of the data?
You know, I've been thinking a lot about that, Laura, because I can't think of a time where data is so much in the headlines every day. I'm in New York, so I listen into Governor Cuomo's press conference every day, right? And he always starts with the data, the latest on hospitalizations, on intubations, on deaths. And everyone is talking about, we're going to make decisions based on data. And yet, as you said, there's so much data out there coming from so many sources, and it gets very hard to understand. Is everyone using the same definitions for infections, for testing, for hospitalizations, whatever? If they're not, then it's going to be really hard to make sense of that. And there's never been, I think, more focus on driving innovation, invention from data in what's really a life or death situation, whether it's finding treatments or patterns of behavior we need to foster, or ultimately vaccines. So you know, as I think about that again, and getting back to my thoughts on the role data governance can play, a key thing, and I think a really good focus would be for various bodies to get together and talk about, can we align our definitions? So when we have these different data sources, it's very clear what we mean in each case. I think would be a very good place to start, because that allows you to do what you have to do, I think, is combine these data sets and make some sense out of them. And again, I think to have really definitive information about the lineage of where did this data come from, how was it collected, what's being derived, what's being assumed, all that I think is really important to have clarity. And then the reliability question is, I think, again, and I think this is something Laura Massey talks about in her book, it's contextual, right? There are some situations where it's okay to assume some things, and there'll be some situations where you want to be more exact. I mean, there's whole that very fascinating question of looking at the excess deaths, right? You've got the confirmed cases of COVID-19 related deaths, but then you're looking in populations and saying, gee, on a trend basis, that accounts for X% of the excess deaths for this period. You know, what's in that other percentage, and what degree of surety do you need in order to proceed? Because, you know, I think anyone who's worked in the world of data knows there's a trade-off between reaching the highest level of quality, the highest level of completeness, versus the cost of doing that and the time to do that. And obviously we're in a very time-pressured environment. So we need to be thoughtful, I think, in terms of how we're approaching that question of surety. And then I think the other interesting question gets back to the other principle I touched on, the control over access, right? You want to make this data accessible, but there's a lot of personal data very much inherent in this. And as you know, if you drill down, you're getting into some real critical privacy issues. So to really drive the kind of innovation, you're going to have to know a lot about the populations, and you have to be thoughtful about that. Do you restrict the real details to a small group, or do you do aggregation so that you can aggregate information that tells you about certain lifestyles, certain health characteristics without tying them to individuals? Those are, I think, the three applications I see. But I do think it starts, if we landed on a common set of definitions for those for those critical data elements, as we like to say in data governance, that we felt we could align, then that would go a long way toward be able to actually make use of these massive data sets that we're assembling.
Yeah, it seems like we're already off to the races, and it might be almost too late to come back to the definitions, you know, and all of our governors are the ones leading the charge. So we necessarily don't have, you know, leadership in place that understands the data and the intricacies. And, you know, when we see these reports, it seems like we're getting just one view of the data. It's like, how many hospitalizations, how many are infected, how many have passed away, and those are the numbers they stick to. So I think, you know, now we're starting to collect some really good data that we can start doing some meaningful crunching and really understanding this problem at a different level. I mean, wouldn't you agree with that?
I would agree, and you know, there's some work underway. I came across last night that a company that has a data catalog product called Alation, A-L-A-T-I-O-N, is creating a data catalog for all the public data sets that are out there, and that will soon be available to the public. You can sign up for it. You can go to their site and read about it. And I thought that, as you say, we are off to the races. Things are moving fast. We can't stop and say, gosh, we got to define everything. I mean, that would be the old data governance approach. But if you can at least provide some structure through a data catalog, which allows the user to at least maneuver through these different sets of data and understand, okay, where were they from? How is that set being defined? It's not going to be common, but at least I can make sense of, okay, here they're using these metrics, there they're using those metrics, how can I combine them? But at least if that information's there, I think that could be very powerful. And again, that can and that's, I think, some of the more exciting technology in the data governance space is data catalogs, because they use automation, they use machine learning, artificial intelligence to scan sets of data and come up with the characteristics, so then they can add them to the catalog. And that's a great tool. I think that goes right to one of the priorities, I think, that comes with the approach I'm recommending.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you have any kind of like final thoughts you'd like to share, or some other insights you think our audience can draw from your article, and maybe some of your thoughts on data governance and the healthcare space?
Well, I think what I'm working on now, and what's actually the third article in the series, is ideas that we were just talking about. How do we practically implement and use such a concept? So the three things I talked about: you want to understand your data, you need to align your data, you need to have data that's accessible but secure properly. You've got your data catalogs, I think, are a key thing. The other approach, which is more on the technical side, but I think is this whole area of healthcare data around COVID-19 will be a great place to explore this new technology approach, is data ops. And what data ops is taking the agile methods of software development, which I think are fairly well understood now, this DevOps approach, which is what Google and Amazon use to go from coding to deployment in minutes. But then it makes data central, and it talks about the importance of defining each process by which you assemble the data, because you're always creating data from raw materials, so to speak, and then processing it, data processing, to make it usable in whatever use you need. So if you think about that as a manufacturing process, and that's what ties back to the book I mentioned, Goldrat's book, if you use the manufacturing technique of statistical process control, which is basically you test your product, you test your data at each step of your process, rather than just the end. I mean, that's the traditional way we've always done things, right? We have the output, we do some data quality checks, we find some issues. So what do we do then? We got to go all the way back to the beginning. You've lost time, right? There might be some issue in that process midway through that's causing this bad data, but you're wasting time because you're only picking up at the end. So we think about that approach and says, let's build our data quality tests into each step of our process. And let's focus our developers on spending a little time to do that. And then let's create a way to monitor that and see what's going on. Not only will you spot issues before, but you may see some interesting, and in this case with something like COVID-19, some really crucial variances that you'll overlook when you were looking at the final aggregated data, but you see it, gee, you know, there's interesting variation here. Let's delve into that. So I think that's a really important technique that people can use, because I'm sure people are building on the fly various aggregation coding and transformation coding with all this data to get them something that yields the report or the aggregation they need. And if they think about, okay, well, let's make sure that we're testing the reasonableness of that data or the completeness of that data on each step and monitoring that, that I think will add value. It makes the data more trusted. And you also find, I really do believe, some very interesting insights from those variations.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. And where can folks find you? Do you have a personal website, or can we find you on LinkedIn? And when can we expect your next article to be posted, and where will we find it?
So you can find me on LinkedIn under Randy Gordon. And my next article is in the works. I hope to get it out to Bob Seiner, who is one of my favorite data governance thinkers, and he has his TDAN newsletter, tdan.com. So he's published my first two articles. I know he's interested in my third. So I hope to get that out to him by the end of this month, and look for it there.
Okay, great. Well, we really appreciate your time during this crazy and unprecedented time, and some of your insights on data governance. I will certainly make sure we get the link up to your article about the fugue and the data governance in our description on the YouTube channel, and would look forward to having you again in the near future, maybe to talk about your next piece.
Thank you so much, Laura. I really have enjoyed the conversation, and yes, I'd really look forward to that.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for joining us.